Thank you. I promise that I am at the right conference. We're going to talk about empathy and just how important it is. And you may not have noticed, but this has been a thread through pretty much every conversation that has been on stage. To tell you a little bit about how I came to this place of empathy and software and all of those things, I want to take you back to 2009 when I attended my high school reunion. Now, my first part of my career prior to that, I was in marketing, I got my degree in business, and then I worked in strategic communications, which is how do you use words to drive results, right? And I had a blog, I had run my own business, and at my reunion, a friend of mine who I've known since I was 11 came up to me and said, I love fixing legacy code using agile methodology, and I want to make a business out of it, and I think you should be my CEO. And you've met this person, he spoke earlier. His name's Scott. And I told him, I was like, I think that you're asking the wrong person because I don't know what half of those words mean. And he said, no. I've read your blog. You think like a programmer. You might not identify as a programmer, but the way that you're thinking about algorithms and inputs and outputs and how to use Boolean logic to construct messages efficiently, that is programming. So I ended up we started the company together, Corgi Bytes, old code, new tricks. We've been working together as kind of a side gig, so we were pairing a lot the first 2 years. And then we got our own office. Oh my gosh. If anybody here has run a business, and then you get your first off-site office, it felt so amazing. And at this point, we weren't coding next to each other on the couch on nights and weekends. This was now our real job. And so I had learned a little bit about Agile at this point, and one of the concepts was the last responsible moment, right? We don't plan too much ahead, and we wait. So I had a situation where I had been waiting for the last responsible moment. There was a client who needed something. I kept kind of deferring because Scott had been working on a really big project, and he had his headphones in, and I knew that he didn't like to be interrupted. Right? I knew that, and I was trying very hard to respect him, but I genuinely felt that this was the last responsible moment, and if I didn't interrupt him, we were at risk of losing this client. So I was like, okay, maybe if I tiptoe over. I know he doesn't, so I creep over to his desk really quietly. I'm like, hi. And I was like, you got a sec? How many people here have a visceral reaction and this is exactly what happened with Scott. And he has given me permission to mock him on stage. It was like he wanted to flip the desk. And he turned at me very sarcastically and goes, I do now. Now, coming from strategic communications and marketing, this was normal. This was how we interrupted each other culturally, right? Go to somebody's desk, hey, you got a sec? No, catch me at the end of the day. Okay, right? That was I had never experienced somebody acting that way. So in that moment, I had two options. I could either give in to my impulse and rage quit, because I was like, I can't do this. If I can't interrupt you, I can't work with you, right? I could feed into that stereotype that people who code are good with machines, but aren't good with people, which is a message that Scott had internalized very deeply. But made no sense to me because, in general, he's one of the most kind and compassionate people that I've ever met. So The other option was I could pause and take a deep breath. And I could say, I don't know what I just did, but I don't want to do that again. This is a behavioral pattern that we're going to have to figure out. I will need to interrupt you throughout running a business together. So we need to solve this problem. And he told me that the problem was that he had constructed, oh, I need to take them out. Is that better? Okay. Do you still need this one? Okay. So he had told me that what had happened in that moment was, he said, I had built a crystal palace of mental models in my mind, and it had taken me 4 hours, and I was this close to solving a problem. Does this sound like a familiar experience to people in the room? I see a lot of hands. Yes. I had no insight into that. And he said, when you asked the question, you got a sec? The cognitive load that it took to just come up with an answer, I was 9 inception layers down. We had just seen the movie from Chris Nolan. He was like, I was in a dream within a dream within a dream, and everything came crashing. Because is it a sec? No. You tend to ask for 20 minutes. How close am I to this? And I was like, so I didn't know any of this, but hearing Scott's perspective changed everything. And then it went from him, like, he's not being a jerk. I don't understand. So we sat down, we went to lunch, and we hashed it out, right? How do we solve this problem? And how many people in this room, if you could solve this problem of being interrupted elegantly, where it didn't snap you out of context, how many people would say that that would bring more joy to your work? Yeah, right? So what we came up with, we went back and forth and like, here's a bunch of different stuff that we can do. And we came up with what we said, inception. What if I just said, inception? Sent you a text, Slack message. And that was it. And then he could reply, or I could reply, 0, I'm available, right? What's up? Or 4, but give me a few minutes. Or, Scott would ask me, like, inception. Okay, I'll check back later. But at that point, I know that he's looking for me. Inception, sorry, I need to interrupt with you anyway. I can count on one hand the number of times that this has happened to us in 10 years. And then also, we can take care of each other. So Scott, here's an example of him being kind and compassionate. I can tell that your inception level is pretty high. I'd also like to remind you that you need to eat so you don't get hangry, right? We solved this problem, and it worked. And we knew that the heart of the reason that we were able to solve this problem was empathy. So when we built our culture, and when we started hiring people, we decided to make empathy the DNA of our company. It would be the heart of all of our decision making, whether it was, how do we code, what operations do we do? It was going to be everything. And so, speaking with Filene, this was a perspective that I had that, isn't typically thought of in the software industry. But we were laughed at. People had said, no, you can't say, we had a consultant who said, you can't say the word empathy and software in the same sentence because you will be laughed out of the industry. So I'm somebody where it's like, oh, yeah, that means I'm going to double down, right? So that began kind of an obsession of figuring out what empathy is, how to articulate it in a way where we can make it part of our daily practice in the same way that we use red-green refactor to drive tests. We can use what I will present in a little bit, collect, connect, communicate, as a mental framework for how we can make decisions. Because that's exactly what I did, right? I collected myself, I paused, I tried to understand, and then we worked together to find a solution that was right in front of us. So in the learning, and I've been looking at a lot of science around this, but there's one researcher in particular that I have just found a lot of joy in reading his work. So if I were to put this slide up here, the functional architecture of something involves parallel distributed processing in a number of dissociable computational mechanisms. Fill in the blank. What could that be? What are some probably computing things? Anyone? It's empathy. So this is from the work of Dr. Jean Dicity. He studies the architecture of human empathy. And in reading his papers, he says, the construct of empathy needs to be decomposed. That's what we do in software systems. One can justifiably question the heuristic of conceptual advantages of using empathy as a monolith. We need to start breaking down empathy and related phenomena into its component processes. This is what we do in software. There's a lot of similarities here. And so DCD has come up with at least 4 functional components in our brains, in our bodies, that all work together that empathy emerges. So it has aspects of emotion, aspects of cognition, analytical thinking, regulation. That was one that surprised me. But I can't hear somebody else's perspective unless I'm in a place where I'm able to receive. And then motivation. And the big piece here is compassion, which is caring about another person and not wanting to see them suffer, wanting to do something about it. But the challenge that we have is that, the way that culturally we think about empathy, it tends to be really a stereotyped thing. So there's another empathy researcher, his name's Jamil Zaki, out of the University of out of Stanford. And he actually has what he calls the Roddenberry hypothesis, which shows that we tend to categorize ourselves into either I am a psychic and therefore an empath, or I am an android, like Data, and therefore emotions elude me. And this isn't the way that empathy works, right? It's not necessarily an inherited trait. It's not mind reading. It's not automatic. It's not this self-other merging. Instead, what we're learning is that it's really more complex than we thought. It's about motivation. It's multidimensional. There's a whole lot that goes into it. It's context specific. Our empathy levels go up and down based on who we're interacting with. Our accuracy rates are low. William Ikes is a researcher who studies empathic accuracy. And good friends, and we're right about 20% of the time when it comes to empathy. Best friends, marriage partners, about 35%. The best people who have ever been measured ever are wrong half the time. So if you're sitting here and saying, I'm bad with people because 7 out of 10 times I get it wrong, guess what? You're actually pretty good, right? But that level setting and knowing these things, that can make a big difference. So when I think of empathy, kind of overall what it is this mechanism that we have evolved as a human species so that we can effectively work together for species survival. This is what helped us take down mammoths. This is what helped us, create agriculture, right? Build technology. So this is an inherent part of are human species, and in populations, we have variability. There is no one empathy stereotype. It is all of us being able to work together and solve problems. So how do we put this into practice? The best way that I have found, and the most effective kind of in our in our testing of things, as I've been writing the book, I've come up with a bajillion different models. Dawn, I loved your reference to George Box earlier. That's one of my favorites too. About all models are wrong, some are useful. And what I found is that the most important skill for empathy is a reappraisal. And this is a fancy psychological term for stopping and thinking before you act, especially when you are in kind of a high activated state. So when it's like, I had the choice to rage quit, I could act on that impulse, or I could pause and think about what I want to do. Now, just doing the pause has a lot of benefits in and of itself. If you get into the habit, you will tend to experience more positive emotions, less stress, higher levels of life satisfaction. You're more likely to be liked by others, closer relationships with your peers, and more social support. So if you only take away one habit, it's pausing, right? Makes a big difference. But then it's like, well, okay, what do you do in that pause? And similar to red-green refactor, I, have found that these three words make a big difference. Collect, connect, communicate. So first we collect. This is our self, right? It's very important that we have a self-concept. We're not merging ourselves into somebody else's situation, because what that does is it injects our own bias into how we interpret it, and it can also introduce distress. So we anchor ourselves in compassion. Then we consider that other person's perspective, right? And some of the things that, depending on how important the conversation is, you may need to do a deeper analysis of this. It could also be a quick gut check that takes 10 seconds, maybe even less. But some of the things that you might want to consider is, what's my capacity? Am I tired? Like right now, I'm a little jet lagged, right? I flew in from Virginia, right? So what's my motivation? What are beliefs, right? What are people's goals? And the more that you can get those things into alignment, the better. So the more data you have about somebody, the easier this is going to be, which is why it's really difficult for us to have empathy with people who are different from us. But that's so important because you can't get innovation without that diversity of thought, right? That magical inception framework, which has worked so well, would not have happened if I was with a bunch of people who didn't see a problem with it, right? It was that negotiation between it. The other thing is the communicate, and this is great. You can use your existing software expertise because there's computational underpinnings of this. So this is the model of a general communication system, which was developed by Claude Shannon in the 1940s and 50s. And Claude Shannon is really the founder of information theory. He coined the term bit for binary digit. He was like, you know what? There's this cool thing, Boolean algebra. I bet you we could use binary digits to convert things into if statements, and so he's really foundational. And he came up with this: how do you get a bit of information from point A to point B? This is how our modern internet runs, right? This is how systems work. You've got a source, a message, transmitter, it goes across the channel, there's a receiver, the message gets decoded, and then it arrives at its destination. What struck me when I first started learning how to code was that I had seen this before. And I was like, is that a derivative? Where did that come from? But there's a guy named Warren Weaver who then took Claude Shannon's work and collaborated with him on then how to apply this to human systems too. So in all of my communication classes, like, this was very familiar, right? And that means that we are already empowered with a lot of the things we need to do to debug our systems, right? Slight tweaks of language, just to kind of make this a little bit clearer. We've got our concept, our message, and then there's you, right? And then in the channel, it's not just the digital information, it's not just the sound waves. There's also a relationship channel, like how well do I know you, how much do I want to preserve this information, what's the trust, that kind of thing. And then you're speaking to another individual, or you're considering another person's perspective, and then that message gets decoded and they convert it into meaning. So what we're doing here is when we do the collect, connect, communicate, we're setting up two nodes of the different systems. So we've got ourselves, right? What's my message? What's the concept I want to send? We're connecting to someone else, and then we're figuring out how to communicate with each other. And there's some cool stuff here around like the inverse relationship between entropy and compression, and really cool stuff that definitely applies. But what we can do then is we can both proactively and also retrospectively do kind of an incident report, right? Where was the breakdown? And this is a useful tool because then that way it helps us stay out of blame, right? And it helps us give us a tool for, okay, well, communication naturally breaks down sometimes. What was the thing that caused it? And how can we together come up with a solution where we can prevent that from happening in the future? So a couple of stories that, have put this into practice that I feel are pretty powerful. The first is, I had a friend named Taylor. He's a web developer. And we worked in the same co-working space. And he would tell me, like, we would talk about accessibility, right? It's like, oh, sometimes I'm so stressed and I'm embarrassed to admit this, but I don't fill out alt tags the way I should. And sometimes I leave them blank. And a lot of this was just like, I don't know, what a screen reader needs. It was very abstract, right? And I think this is exactly what someone was talking about before, was that you can have accessibility rules and guidelines, but if you don't put them into practice all the time, right, then it's not doing it. So Taylor ended up being in a car accident, and he lost his vision, and gratefully recovered, and then became still was a web developer as he was blind. And he was like, I had no idea how much this matters. And in learning about a very specific person's challenge, that's where the empathy comes in, and that's where we then get motivated. So instead of skipping, it's like, okay, now I want to learn. And every time I'm tempted, it's like, nope, nope, nope. I know someone who cares. And this is an example of why it's so important for developers to have access to actual customers' conversations of them describing what it feels like, right? Sometimes when we do personas or things like that, things get abstracted in just demographics. We can't connect emotionally to that. So another one was the visceral reaction that I ended up having, which I would go, you know what we could do? We could do this big picture thing, and here's all these ideas. And then Scott would interrupt me and go, well, actually, that's not going to work. How many people default to this? Well, I know there's a lot of people who are like to fix things. And we were able to have a conversation around this, and I was like, you're just trying to make me look stupid. You're just trying to show me that my ideas don't work. And he was like, no, I care very deeply about your ideas. It's coming from a compassionate place. But it would take me so much out of my inception that it was hard. So then we, again, came up with a framework. And, it's paused. So instead of saying, well, actually, that won't work, we decided, okay, help me understand, what kind of feedback are you looking for in this moment? Macro feedback, which is just big structural changes. Micro feedback, are you looking to me to pinpoint the very specific details, which he's great at, And there are absolutely times where I want that. Or are you just looking for me to be a rubber duck and, like, nod my head? And all of those are viable. But then that gives information of this is the type of interaction that is going to best serve our needs and enable us to actually do work better instead of devolving into frustration. And one of the last ones was from a workshop. I give a workshop, it's pretty popular, called Productive Conflict, which helps people kind of figure out these problems that are work and co-create solutions together. So there was one, and kind of the process was there's a test engineer who was attending, and the process was that the customer service would put together kind of a bug description of some patterns they were seeing. The test engineer would then test it, put together a comprehensive report on what needed to be done, and then it got passed down to the developer, who would then implement the reports. Now, there are structural challenges and cultural challenges to the pass the potato, right? But in this immediate moment, the test engineer was really frustrated because his test plans weren't being implemented, and there were bugs. And so his assessment of the developer that he worked with was, he's lazy. He doesn't care. And it's so tempting for us to go there. And the reason, again, this is another technicality that once we know what's going on under the hood, we can see it. So this is the fundamental attribution bias, which is a big bias most of us have. Biases need to be balanced. We don't need to eliminate them because, like, literally our brains need them to navigate the world. But what we do in biases is we discard information. So we need to consciously look at things more holistically and fill in the blanks. So the appraisal was kind of your first gut instinct, right? So the test engineer was like, I take the time to write very detailed instructions, because the fundamental attribution bias, what it is that when something goes wrong for us, we ascribe it to our circumstance. But when something goes wrong with someone else, it's their character flaw. Right? This was exactly what was happening, right? He's lazy, that's why. So what we need to do then is just balance it. So, okay, what's going on in your character? What could be contributing? And the number, like, there's two biggies that I found: shame and contempt. So shame is I'm afraid of losing a sense of belonging. Contempt is I feel like I'm better than someone. And when I mention contempt, he goes, well, I am better. And literally, as the words exited his mouth and he heard himself say it out loud, he was like, I don't actually believe that. And that unlocked everything. And all of a sudden, he was like, oh my gosh, I feel contempt. And I'm writing really detailed test plans to cover my butt if something goes wrong. There's some shame in there, too. And now I can see my developer, he told me he has ADHD, and he's a really demanding boss, and me giving him a 30-page report that is only prose, that's not helping. And within 2 minutes, he was able to say, I think I'm going to reach out to him and say, I think the way I'm not giving you test plans is working. Would it be more helpful if I recorded a video and then gave you timestamps of the place? All of a sudden, he was able to take accountability and see the problem for what it was. And this happened because of a technical understanding of empathy. So there's very deep expertise to explore here. So in Collect, we've got a lot of different things, right? And then within capacity, within one of these, we were talking about fractals last night at dinner, and this is absolutely in there. Like every single one of these, you can go deeper and deeper and deeper. And there's lots of different opportunities, right? We can do this when we're writing the code, when we're designing interfaces, when we're writing tests, when we're writing commit messages, when we're doing code reviews. Those are all artifacts that happen around the code. When we're making decisions, what should we work on? What's our scope? What's our budget? What's our priority? How should we apply ethics? It happens with conflict, which is inevitable. But how can we turn that conflict into innovation instead of frustration, right? Relationships, You've got your boss, your coworkers, your friends, stakeholders. Like, how do you use this to advance your work forward, right? You can use empathy to help sell your ideas more, to help people who don't code understand the importance of your work. Habits like interrupting or maybe criticizing, understanding our biases, and then improvements. So doing our reflections and our retrospectives, creating a culture of experimentation, and then developing innovative protocols to help us think about different ways that we want to work together more efficiently. So when we look at all of this, I argue that empathy is a technical skill, especially when we go back and look at the root of the word. It comes from Greek, techne, and that means technique, not technology. The idea that technical only relates to technology goes back to only the 1980s. And I have a whole other talk about like the divide between soft and hard skills and like the myth that it is and all the ways that that kind of embedded into our cultural narrative. But you can be technical in any domain. Technologists do not have a monopoly on being technical. An artist is technical. A basketball player is technical. A parent is technical. When you're honing these skills, when you're paying attention to your situational awareness, when you're developing deeper and nuanced knowledge, when you're able to execute efficiently and get results, and operating professionally and ethically, like those are the things that make empathy a technical skill. So I'll leave with a quote that I love from Arthur C. Clarke, which is, "Any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic." And I like to adapt it a little, that any sufficiently advanced skill is indistinguishable from magic. I see ice skaters or Simone Biles, and I'm like, that is magic. How do you make your body do that, right? But it's a lot of training and learning and practice. And the same is true with empathy. If you have categorized yourself as someone who isn't good with people, or, oh, they're so good they can walk into a room, like a lot of times there are learnable skills that you can practice. And once you know the frameworks and the underpinnings of why these things happen, then that way we can make progress together. So we don't code just for the compiler. Our code needs to execute, right? It needs to work. But it doesn't stop there. We code for people. All code is communication, and empathy is a technical skill. So, thank you.
Thank you, Andrea. That was a really profound talk, and I like the way it links into a lot of the things we've heard, also into the psychological safety and pretty much everything.